The morning everything started looked so ordinary that if you had driven past my ranch, you probably would have thought the biggest thing on my mind was whether we'd finally get enough rain to keep the north pasture green. I was sitting on the back porch with a chipped coffee mug that had somehow survived 3 decades of hard use, watching my cattle drift through the grass while the sun slowly climbed over the oak trees. Out here, mornings usually sound the same. Wind pushing through cedar branches, boots scraping old wooden boards, cows complaining about absolutely nothing. It's the kind of silence you don't appreciate until someone decides to break it. I noticed the SUV first, the bright white, spotless, crawling down my gravel driveway like it belonged there. Then another one followed behind it. Before I could even stand up, 3 strangers climbed out wearing matching navy polo shirts with shiny embroidered patches that read Community Patrol. One woman adjusted her mirrored sunglasses, picked up a clipboard, and walked straight toward my barn without so much as looking at the house. Another guy started taking pictures before his boots even touched the pasture. The third one unfolded what looked like a property map and pointed toward my fence as if he was leading a military operation instead of trespassing on private land. I remember setting my coffee down and laughing because my brain honestly refused to believe what my eyes were seeing. I figured maybe somebody had the wrong address. Maybe they were surveyors. Maybe the GPS had sent them to the wrong ranch. People make mistakes. I walked down the porch steps and waved. "Morning, folks. You looking for somebody?" The woman barely glanced at me before pointing her phone at my tractor. "We're documenting multiple community violations," she said in a voice so rehearsed it sounded like she'd practiced it in front of a mirror. I looked behind me to see if maybe she was talking to somebody else. "Community?" I asked. "Ma'am, the nearest subdivision is almost a mile that way." She smiled without actually smiling. "Sir, your property has been identified as creating visual and environmental concerns affecting the neighboring residential development." I actually chuckled. "You mean my cows?" The younger guy snapped another picture. "Livestock exposure, deteriorated fencing, unapproved agricultural equipment visible from community roads." I stared at him for a second before looking back at the woman. "You folks serious?" "Completely." She tapped her clipboard. "You'll receive formal notice." I crossed my arms. Formal notice from who? The homeowners association. That was the moment I realized these people weren't confused. They were convinced they had authority over land my family had owned since my great-grandfather built the first cabin here with his own hands. "I'm not in your HOA," I said calmly. "Never have been." She nodded like she'd already expected that answer. "That doesn't eliminate community impact." I laughed harder than I probably should have. "Lady, neither does the sunrise." She didn't appreciate the joke. They spent another 20 minutes wandering around my pasture taking pictures of fences, tractors, hay bales, even my old red pickup that hadn't moved in 6 months. One of them crouched down to photograph cow tracks in the mud. I still don't know what violation muddy hoof prints were supposed to prove, but apparently somebody thought it mattered. When they finally drove away, my ranch foreman, Wade, pulled up in his speed truck. He watched the SUVs disappear down the road and asked, "Friends of yours?" "If they are," I said, "I've clearly made some terrible life decisions." We laughed, shrugged it off, and got back to work because ranches don't stop running just because strange people invent imaginary authority. By the following Monday, the first certified letter arrived. According to 6 pages of official-looking paperwork, I'd accumulated nearly $4,000 in violations for creating an unattractive view, maintaining inconsistent fencing aesthetics, allowing agricultural odors to impact nearby homeowners, and failing to comply with architectural standards I'd never agreed to. Wade read the letter twice before folding it back into the envelope. "They're kidding, right?" "I thought so," I answered. "Now I'm not so sure." Instead of throwing it away, I placed it in a file cabinet aside property deeds, tax records, and family documents dating back almost a century. My father always used to say that paper has a funny way of becoming important long after people stop paying attention to it. I didn't know it then, but that simple decision would end up saving me, because the letter wasn't the end of their campaign. It was their invitation to something much bigger, something far stranger, and before long those polite little notices would turn into fake complaints, broken fences, hidden cameras, and a fight that would pull half the county into a battle nobody saw coming. The next 2 weeks taught me something I'd never really understood before. Real intimidation doesn't usually begin with someone kicking your front door in. It starts with tiny cuts, little annoyances that seem too ridiculous to fight because each one by itself looks harmless. 3 more certified letters showed up. then 2 emails from lawyers I'd never heard of. Then a county complaint claiming my livestock fence had somehow extended onto HOA property, even though that fence had been standing longer than most of the subdivision residents had been alive. Every complaint required phone calls, paperwork, and meetings. Every hour I spent answering nonsense was an hour I wasn't fixing equipment or checking cattle. Somebody knew exactly what they were doing. Wade leaned against the shop one afternoon holding another envelope and muttered, "They're trying to make running this place more expensive than it's worth." I looked across the pasture toward the rows of expensive new houses sitting on the ridge beyond my north field. Glass balconies, decorative stone walls, perfect little lawns that looked like nobody had ever actually walked across them. The subdivision had been built 3 years earlier by a development company that advertised country living with luxury convenience. Apparently nobody had mentioned that actual country living involved tractors, livestock, dust, and the occasional smell of cattle after a summer rain. A few days later, I met the woman behind the clipboard again. Her name, I learned, was Evelyn Mercer, president of the Redstone Bluffs Homeowners Association. She arrived in a golf car with 2 board members trailing behind her like security guards. She stopped outside my gate without asking permission to enter this time, almost as if she decided appearances mattered now the paperwork had begun. "Mr. Carter," she called, "I'd like to discuss a reasonable solution." I walked over, resting both hands on the gate. "Sounds promising," she smiled. "Our residents have invested significant money into preserving property values. Your ranch presents certain challenges. It's presented those challenges for about 100 years. The community wasn't here then." "Exactly." She ignored that. "The board is willing to help with relocation costs." I blinked. "Relocation? Moving your livestock operations farther west?" I actually laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. "You're asking me to move an entire working ranch because people who bought houses next door don't like looking at cows?" Her voice stayed perfectly calm. "We're asking you to become a cooperative neighbor. By leaving my own land?" She folded her hands. "We believe everyone benefits from compromise." "Funny," I replied. "Your version of compromise seems to involve me giving up everything while you give up absolutely nothing." Her smile disappeared for the first time. "Then I'm afraid this situation may become uncomfortable." She drove away before I answered. Wade watched the golf cart disappear and quietly said, "That wasn't the conversation." "No," I answered. "That was a warning." From that point forward, things escalated almost daily. Somebody cut one strand of fencing along the east pasture, not enough to release cattle, just enough to force repairs. Then fresh tire tracks appeared across my hayfield where no vehicle had any business driving. One morning, we found bright orange survey flags stuck into my property every 20 feet. There wasn't any survey crew around, just the flags. I pulled them out myself. The next morning, they were back. Then the phone calls started. Anonymous complaints claiming neglected animals, complaints about excessive noise, complaints about illegal burning. County inspectors arrived twice, apologized both times, completed their inspections, and quietly admitted every report had been unfounded. One inspector, an older fellow named Dennis, looked around my barn before climbing into his truck. "Between you and me," he said, "I've responded to 7 complaints from this subdivision in the last month. You're number 6. "Who's number 7? "The beekeeper on the other side of town." We both laughed, but neither of us found it particularly funny. I finally decided enough was enough. Instead of getting angry, I started documenting everything. Cameras went up at every gate. Motion sensors covered the equipment sheds. Wade's nephew helped install 2 discrete trail cameras overlooking the tree line where strangers kept appearing. I even dug out an old drone I'd barely used and started flying short inspections every evening before sunset. My father had always believed that memories fade but recordings don't. Turns out he was right. The first useful footage came only 4 days later. 2 HOA golf carts rolled through a section of fencing that had been left unlatched. They wandered nearly 300 yards onto my pasture while one passenger pointed toward different buildings as another snapped photographs. Nobody attempted to contact me. Nobody announced themselves. They simply acted as though private ownership was an inconvenience. Then things crossed a line I couldn't laugh about anymore. One evening just after dark, my Australian shepherd, Duke, started barking toward the cottonwood grove behind the equipment barn. He almost never barked unless somebody was actually there. Wade and I grabbed flashlights and walked toward the trees. Whoever had been hiding there took off before we got close enough to identify them, but they left something behind. A small camouflage trail camera strapped high against the trunk with its lens aimed directly at my back porch. We checked the area and found another one overlooking the workshop. Neither belonged to me. I handed both cameras to the sheriff's office the next morning. Deputy Elena Brooks looked at the evidence bags and frowned. "Did you authorize anyone to place surveillance equipment on your property?" "Not unless cows have figured out online shopping." Even she laughed before becoming serious again. "Leave these with us." A week passed with unusual silence. Honestly, that worried me more than the harassment had. People who thrive on control rarely quit without planning something bigger. Sure enough, on the following Saturday morning, I heard engines revving near the north entrance. 5 golf carts rolled through my open service gate before any of us could react. Nearly a dozen HOA volunteers wearing matching shirts spread across the pasture carrying clipboards, measuring tapes, and orange spray paint. One man actually started marking my fence posts with inspection numbers. I walked straight toward them while Wade called the sheriff. "Folks," I shouted, "you're trespassing." Evelyn Mercer stepped forward as though she'd rehearsed the scene. "This inspection has been approved by the association." "That's wonderful," I answered. "Now show me where my signature appears on anything giving you permission to be here." She raised a stack of papers. "Community Enforcement Authority." I didn't even look at them. "Community ends at my fence." She stepped closer. "You're obstructing an official compliance review." I smiled. "Official according to who?" She didn't answer because she couldn't. Instead, she waved toward her volunteers. "Continue documenting." That was the moment Deputy Brooks arrived with 2 patrol vehicles behind her. She stepped out, took one slow look across the pasture, then asked a question so simple the entire crowd went quiet. "Who owns this land?" I raised my hand. Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, but the deputy held up a finger. "I didn't ask who dislikes it. I asked who owns it." Silence. Complete silence. Then the deputy looked back at Evelyn and calmly said, "Unless you have legal authorization from the property owner or a court order, everyone standing beyond that fence line needs to leave immediately." For the first time since this whole circus began, I saw uncertainty spread across Evelyn's face. She wasn't scared yet, but the confidence she'd worn like expensive perfume had started to crack, and I had a feeling that once people like her realized intimidation wasn't working, they would either back down or do something desperate enough to change this dispute forever. I wish I could tell you Deputy Brooks showing up ended everything, but people who spend too much time believing they're untouchable usually don't stop because someone tells them they're wrong. They stop when reality finally hands them a bill. 3 days after the deputy ordered everyone off my property, my attorney called before sunrise. "I've got something you need to see." By noon, I was sitting in his office, looking at a stack of documents that explained more than I expected. The development company that built Redstone Bluffs had quietly promised buyers protected rural views in their marketing materials, even though they had never owned a single acre of my ranch. Somewhere along the way, the HOA board had convinced itself that if they made ranch life miserable enough, I'd eventually sell. It was never about ugly fences or noisy cattle. It was about expanding property values one pasture at a time. Suddenly, every strange complaint, every fake violation, every staged inspection fit together like pieces of the same puzzle. My attorney smiled for the first time since we'd met. They've spent months creating evidence against themselves. The sheriff's office had the hidden cameras. The county had records proving every complaint was unfounded. My own security system had captured repeated trespassing, damaged fencing, unauthorized inspections, and board members directing volunteers across private land. Then came the county mediation meeting. Evelyn Mercer arrived with 3 attorneys and the same confident posture she'd worn since the first day she stepped onto my ranch. She looked across the room and said, "Mr. Carter has been unwilling to cooperate with the surrounding community." I almost laughed. Instead, I slid a hard drive across the table. "Before we discuss cooperation," I said, "I'd like everyone here to watch about 15 minutes of video." Nobody interrupted after that. The room stayed quiet while one recording after another showed board members entering my property, volunteers ignoring warnings to leave, golf carts driving through my pasture, hidden cameras strapped to my trees, and conversations they clearly never expected anyone else to hear. By the time the last clip ended, even one of Evelyn's attorneys had quietly lowered his eyes. The county mediator leaned back in his chair and simply asked, "Does the association dispute the authenticity of these recordings?" No one answered. They couldn't. Within weeks, the HOA agreed to a settlement. They reimbursed the damage to my fencing, covered my legal expenses, withdrew every fabricated violation, and signed a permanent agreement prohibiting any board representative or contractor from entering my property without written permission. Evelyn resigned before the next board election. I heard she blamed everyone except herself. Funny how that works. People who spend months insisting accountability is for someone else usually discover they're standing alone when it finally arrives. Life on the ranch slowly became quiet again. The survey flags disappeared. The certified letters stopped showing up. My mornings went back to sounding the way they should. Wind through the trees, cattle moving across open grass, Wade complaining about coffee that somehow tasted worse every single year. One evening we stood by the repaired north fence watching the sun settle behind the hills. Wade grinned and said, "Think they'll be back?" I looked across the valley, where those expensive houses reflected the last light of the day. "Maybe somebody will," I answered, "but they'll probably knock first." We both laughed because after everything that had happened, it felt good to laugh without wondering what fresh problem tomorrow would bring. Every now and then someone asks if I hate the people who tried to force me off my land. Honestly, I don't. Hate takes too much energy, and ranching already gives me enough work. What I do believe is this: ownership matters, boundaries matter, and respect matters. Communities only work when the rules apply to everyone, including the people who think they wrote them. My family has cared for that ranch for generations, and if there's one lesson this whole mess left behind, it's that sometimes the strongest fence isn't built from cedar posts or barbed wire. It's built from patience, good records, and the willingness to stand your ground without becoming the very thing you're fighting. If you've ever dealt with neighbors, an HOA, or anyone who believed power gave them permission to ignore common sense, I'd genuinely like to hear your story. Who do you think was right here? Did the HOA cross a line the moment they stepped onto private land? Or should neighboring communities have some say over what happens next door? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because these conversations are always more interesting when everyone brings a different perspective. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.